Thank you. And we begin with those rising trade frictions between China and the United States. China's Commerce Ministry says Beijing has filed a case with the World Trade Organization against U.S. tariffs. Beijing is accusing Washington of triggering the largest scale trade war in history as the world's two biggest economies step up trade tensions. Chinese Premier Li Keqiang warned there can be no winners in a trade war. He said China will continue to open up no matter how much the global landscape changes. And China's foreign ministry called for all sides to work together to resolve trade issues. Our reporter Meng Qingsheng has more.
The 25% additional tariffs imposed by the United States on Chinese products worth $34 billion go into effect today. The Chinese Foreign Ministry told a press briefing the U.S. action is a violation of World Trade Organization rules. Ministry spokesman Lu Kang says this will hamper the global economic recovery, trigger global market turmoil, and deal a blow to companies and consumers.
After the U.S. unfairly raised tariffs against China, China immediately put into effect raised tariffs on some U.S. goods. China will report to the WTO and protect the free multilateral trading system with other countries. We never wanted to see trade frictions escalate into a trade war. China hopes that all parties involved could view globalization objectively and work together to solve trade issues.
Lu Kang says China always opposes unilateralism and trade protectionism. It has been trying hard to resolve trade disputes in an objective and rational manner.
Well, Russia has raised import tariffs on some U.S. goods in response to similar moves by Washington and is preparing to take further measures in the future. The Minister for Economic Development says Moscow will put $88 million worth of additional duties in place. Meanwhile, the WTO says one of its new reports on the G20 trade measures indicates a startling increase in trade protectionism by major economies. They issued a warning of the consequences.
The fallout from these measures is already being felt. Companies are hesitating to invest. Markets are getting jittery. Some prices are rising. With further escalation, the effects would only grow in magnitude, hitting jobs and growth in the countries involved and sending economic shockwaves around the world. I am urging all parties to sit down and discuss how to address the issues that are at the root of the tensions we see today.
Well, African countries are directly and indirectly affected by U.S. tariffs and the global trade conflict. CGTN's Chaumgono explains why.
Global trade growth in 2017 was at its strongest since 2011. That's according to the World Trade Organization's annual report. But the WTO is warning that strong performance may be compromised by the escalation of global trade tensions. The WTO says the multilateral trading system can be a force for good globally, promoting stability, creating opportunities, and boosting growth and development. And that's crucial for the developing world. According to experts, emerging markets are struggling to maintain the economic gains. Countries like South Africa are directly affected by U.S. tariffs. It exports around 330,000 tons of steel to the U.S. Economists in South Africa warn that an escalation in the trade spat will lead to further retaliation. That in turn will lead to a global slowdown in trade. Stronger global trade means higher commodity prices. That boosts the economy of commodity-producing nations like South Africa. Analysts say Donald Trump's tit-for-tat protectionism could lead emerging markets under a great deal of pressure. Many African countries have small, open economies with limited domestic markets that need to expand trade. These markets are influenced by growth in the destination trade markets like China, the US, and the EU. If those markets take a hit, so do African economies. Experts in Africa say Donald Trump's escalating rhetoric will lead to more volatility, more vulnerability, and more risk for emerging markets. Chaumgono, CGTN.
And Egyptian businessmen are concerned as well. The country exports steel to the United States and is fearing a drop in sales if the trade tensions escalate. We spoke to CGTN's Yasser Hakim about this.
Obviously, there is concern within the Egyptian businessmen about the trade war between China and the U.S. For example, the U.S. has said that it will impose around 53% tariffs on countries like Egypt and other countries besides China for its steel imports. Now, Egypt's exports to the U.S. concerning steel has risen in the last 2 years by over 250% because of the floating of the Egyptian pound. Now, this has been an important factor to increase revenue for the economically stricken country. Losing this advantage again and having higher tariffs would mean that exports would drop back to very low levels that will affect the revenue coming, the revenue stream coming from exports of steel to the United States, and these exports amount to over around 11% of Egypt's total exports, and therefore it will be a big hit to that industry, to that sector, and the overall numbers coming from revenues of Egypt's exports. Therefore, the businessmen, and some of them, are thinking about alternative markets to re-export its products away from the U.S., which feels that it could be a market that is volatile and will be risky in the next few months. This is one sector we're talking about, which is the steel and aluminum. Obviously, there have been threats by the U.S. that these measures and tariffs and the higher tariffs will go into other products as well, such as agricultural products, and agricultural products are a main export for Egypt. Egypt is a main exporter of agricultural products to the U.S., and again, this can be affected even more than the steel, could have a diverse and negative effect on the Egyptian economy. So yes, there are concerns from businessmen on this regard, but also there could be a positive impact, if you may call it, if countries like China and the European Union, who are at odds with the U.S., would look at alternative markets to import their products, and therefore can look at emerging markets like Egypt and others in Africa and seek their products, their imports from there rather than the U.S.
And adding to those concerns, some economists say the most affected in these tariff wars will be developing countries. They base their judgment on the fact that these countries largely depend on the performance of advanced economies to be sure of development assistance and trading concessions.
We already know that the less developed a country is, the more important trade is to their development program, because they don't have the developed domestic industries to produce what, say, an advanced economy does. And so these trade barriers are important, because to effectively afford imports, you have to be able to export. And the countries effectively also are affected by, if trade is constricted in the world, economic growth, global economic growth is also constricted, and that brings down commodity prices disproportionately, from that particular point of view. So we really need to look at the actual ability of the global economy to continue to grow, because that actually feeds back into commodity prices, and also the ability of African countries to actually export and afford the imports that they do need. Well, basically the first thing is that when it comes to commodity prices, they're very dependent on the actual strength of the global economy. And commodities are also traded, they also form an extremely important part of the actual trade equation in the global trade flows. And so when the global economy slows down, you find that commodity prices come down by more than what the growth would come down by, for example. And that then feeds back into African economies, as I said, disproportionately more than it would be the case, say, for a more advanced economy. The more advanced economies are more resilient and more able to actually cope with a trade war than the smaller, less developed African economies. Well, I think the main issue is that firstly, some of the commodities, Africa is in fact dominant, and they can actually possibly use market power, but that's not really a great option. I think the end result of this trade war, it's only at the beginning stages. We may actually see tariffs come down, and protectionism, especially in the form of agricultural subsidies that you see in advanced countries that the less developed countries can't match. If these come down, it actually may, in the end, produce an advantage, at least a possibility for Africa to come in.
Well, East Africa is also likely to feel the effect of the trade tensions between China and the United States. Earlier, we spoke to economist Edward Kusewa in Nairobi about how concerned East Africa should be.
Okay, I think it has been a very interesting development. The United States has imposed 34 billion worth of tariffs to Chinese commodities that are coming into China. And obviously that affects the global value chain systems. It definitely increases the prices that commodities are priced, and therefore it affects bottom line of companies. East Africa is known to supply some of this raw material to some of the multinationals in China, and therefore an increase in trade barriers definitely leads a decrease in the supply chain. So definitely the global value chains are going to be affected, and obviously some of the raw materials that China gets in Africa is also going to be affected. The continental free trade area is one area that East African states could be able to trade with one another and increase their volumes as far as trade is concerned. In the event of a trade war, and especially the trade war that is happening right now between the United States and China, the only other option that Africa and East Africa has is to start integrating and trading with one another by making sure that there's free trade and opening up the border so that they can trade with different commodities that affect those East African countries. So the best way to go forward is to integrate our economies, to start trading with one another, so that whenever these huge economies and big developed countries start having issues to do with trade wars and counter trade wars, trade barriers, then obviously we have a space for us to trade with one another.